That is faith. You don't have to stand up here the whole time, but that's faith. Faith is not imagining things that don't exist so much as not ignoring things that do exist but we can't see. Write every day down, write every day down, write every day down, write every day down. To the finder of letters, sailing in bottles out on the sea. I'm happy to tell you God lived in these times. You know how I wrote that line? I wrote it starting with this sweet little girl that lived at Ehilism. But I finished that song on the Isle of Wight where I met this very interesting man. And he told us a story of how and I told this last time I was here, and I botched the story so badly that he actually watched it on God TV or something on the Isle of Wight, and they laughed till they were crying. Because I actually got the story messed up, and I said at one point that there were octopus jumping into the boat or something. Anyway. This friend of mine, so I don't tell the story very often, but this friend of mine, he starts telling us this story about how he left England and he went to the United States 30-some years ago, and he wanted to learn how to be a sailor. And he went to the United States from England, left his parents there, and he goes to the United States and he gets saved in the process. And then he ends up in Hawaii. And all he has with him through all of his, learning how to sail and everything and getting it, however that happens, I don't even know. But he has this little letter of recommendation from this sailor back in England that's an old man that says, hey, if you ever get a chance to sail across the sea when you're over there, and there's somebody doing it, get on the boat and give him this recommendation letter. So he gets to Hawaii and he's done with his training and he's gotten saved in this whole process and turned to Jesus and all this has happened. And he gets there and he says, now I'm ready, I want to sail. And they say, well, if you could get an opportunity to sail with this old man that's down, he's actually docked right now. If you could get an opportunity to sail with this old man, he's the guy to sail with across the seas. And he says, well, he says, but the fact is he only sails alone. So he says, well, I'm going to give it a try. So he goes down into the docking area and he walks up to that old man, and the old man's totally grumpy. And he looks at the boy. The boy says to him, this man that I'm talking to now, he says to this old man, hey, you mind if I come sail with you across the ocean? And the old man says, I don't sail with people. And he says, well, would you mind reading my recommendation letter? I got a recommendation letter from England. Would you mind reading that recommendation letter? And the old man says, sure. So he grabs the recommendation letter, he starts reading it, and he says, well, I'll be darned. He says, the guy that wrote the recommendation letter in England was this sailor's only pen pal. So this old man sailor says, I never sail with anybody, but if this man recommends you, boy, you come sail with me. So they start off on their journey, his first sailing journey, and they're going across the seas, and they hit this massive storm. I'm not good at all this stuff, okay? So just be forgiving and graceful to me, merciful to me. But he says they hit this massive storm that's so big, somewhere in between Hawaii and New Zealand. You know what I mean? And they're out there, and this is 30 years removed. This man sitting at his bed and breakfast on the Isle of Wight while I'm writing the song Write Every Day Down. And he's sitting there over dinner, looking over the sea, and he starts to weep. And he says, we're out there in the middle of this storm, and the seas are at 80-foot swells. And we are being tossed. And he begins to shake, and he begins to weep. This is a man's man. This guy is like, I wish he was here to tell the story. At some point, I'm going to film him telling the story so I can just play it for people while I'm singing that song. This man is like Popeye. And it's as if Popeye is sitting in front of you, shaking and crying and saying, nobody knows what it feels like to be that out of control. And he looks at us young men in the band and he says, you just don't know what it feels like. And he's weeping. We are being tossed in the sea in 80-foot swells backwards. We are riding waves backwards. And he says the screaming. And when he says the screaming, he says, I'm so sorry. And he just begins to wail. This is 30-some years removed. He begins to wail and crying. And he says, I'm sorry, whenever I tell a story, I can't even tell a story because I cry so hard just remembering it. He says, the screaming of the wind was so horrible. You can't even imagine what it feels like to hear that. And he says, all I wanted was the screaming to stop. And so in the middle of it all, we're just being tossed at sea. I go down into the inside of the boat and I cover my head and I try to close my ears off, and I pulled out this little Bible, like a Gideon Bible type thing. You know, something somebody gives you when you give your life to God? He pulls out this little Bible and he literally has his head stuff over his ears, and he's got the Bible in front of him, and boats flying all over the place, and he's trying to lay in this thing, you know, and he's being flown all over the place, and he just opens up to a scripture and he says to God, he says, God, and he was involved in various things, and he says, God, if you get me out of this alive, I will serve you the rest of my life. I'll do anything for you. And he says, I must have fallen asleep because I wake up to the old man tying things to my arms and my legs, ropes. And I think, the old man's gone nuts. He wakes up, the old man's tying things to his legs, tying rope to his legs, tying things to his arms. And he says, the old man says to the boy, he says, boy, you're going to have to jump into the ocean and take the rudder off this boat, or we're going to die. And he's telling us a story. He says, okay. I mean, the boat is going down 80-foot swells, and he's telling them, you're going to have to jump under the boat. I'm going to tie you to myself. And you're going to jump under the boat and take the rudder off this boat so that we can live. He jumps off the boat. And he says, when I went under the water, this is all I can tell you, all of a sudden, the screaming stopped. And he said, unbelievably, Jason, unbelievably, guys, I kind of liked it. Because I just wanted that screaming to stop. And I'm underneath the boat, and I can't even breathe. And I got a flashlight. I don't know how you get a flashlight under the boat. Don't even, And I got a flashlight, and I got all this stuff, and I got these tools tied to me, and I'm supposed to go up and take this rudder off the ship. And I know that ship's going to pile into me. I'm going to die. And I go up, and the rudder's almost off the ship. There's just one little thing that needs to be removed. I remove it. I tug on the thing. He pulls me up. The rudder's off the boat. They live through the storm. All of a sudden, they're just out at sea, drifting. They have enough food to survive for a while. They run out of the food. Then all of a sudden, it dawns on him. I never told my mom I was getting on the boat. And he says, believe it or not, guys, I wasn't even as afraid to die as I was sad that my mom would think that I just went off to the U.S. and I never came back, and I never told her where I was going, or that I died, or that she'd be worried the rest of her life whatever happened to me, or sad in her heart that I never came back. And he said, and I wanted my mom to know what happened to me. So I got this piece of paper out and I just started writing my story. And I wrote, to the finder. And I wrote everything that had happened and how I'd gotten saved and how I'd given my life to Jesus. And I tried to make it funny. And I talked about how, all these things were happening and the guy tying stuff to me. And I tried to make it funny. And I wrote this whole note to my mom about how I had given my life to God and how I was going to live my life for Him the rest of my days. And I rolled it up and I put it in a bottle and I corked the bottle and I threw it into the ocean. And he said we had run out of all of our food. We knew we were going to die. I write the letter, I put it in the bottle, I cork it, I throw it out into the sea, hoping that somebody will find it and send it to my mom. And I try to